Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here with an update to the PvE tier list. Now, in patch 7.6 there weren't really any balance changes. Nevertheless, since I released the last tier list in patch 7.4, I got a lot of comments and feedback on the previous list. I also played a bit of PvE, so I changed my mind on some of the specs and I'm going to rank them again. And of course, as with the last tier list, we are mostly thinking about Nightmare or Master Mode operations. If you are playing easier content, so you're getting into story mode or maybe the first hard modes, then you can of course play what you want. So when looking at this list, it's mostly about the hardest content in the game. One exception, since there was a new boss released this patch, which you need to kill to craft the item rating 310 augments. I will take this one into account as well. It's a relatively easy fight if you know how to do it. But if you're doing it with a random fleet group, you will quickly notice that some classes are better than others at carrying a raid. So right now you're looking at the tier list I did in patch 7.4 and starting in S tier. Darkness is still the most played spec in Master Mode content by far. It is quite tanky, has good damage, but most importantly it can avoid a lot of the boss mechanics. Some people might also say cheese them. So Darkness overall will be your go-to tank, and most groups will always want to have one. Moving on to Pyro. Now there were nerfs to the superheated fuel tactical. Many Pyros have switched to flame dissipation now. And to be honest, Pyro does just as much DPS as it did before the patch. I don't even know if it's worth it to slightly downgrade Pyro. For sure it is still S tier, it's tanky as fuck, it has dots, which allow you to keep up your DPS during movement phases. And of course it can leech with Pyro Shield and Reflective Armor. So as I said, Pyro still stays in S tier. Annihilation, nothing really changed, it's still the king of the Marauders. It's a very good spec at supporting your healers if they are maybe struggling and you're a new group progressing into Master Mode, because the group healing is quite insane. Of course Predation is very nice raid utility as well. So Annihilation for sure still an S tier DPS spec. Next we have Vengeance, no change here either. It's still the king of AoE, has the most broken area damage in the game because of the cut to pieces tactical, which enables you to spam your slam. But the single target tactical Hemophilic Slashes is also not bad, makes it so it can actually compete with Rage for boss DPS. And then of course it's a Jug, so it has quite good mobility, it has utility as well, has immunities, really everything you want for PvE, AoE damage reduction on top of that. It's also insane on the new lair boss on Illum. If the tanks are moving the boss correctly, then you can AoE off the ads and just kill everything, makes the game really easy that way. So Vengeance for sure, one of the best and most popular classes for DPSing in PvE. Next we have Bodyguard. I had it in S tier previously and it will stay in S tier. It's the best overall healer, also the most played for Master Mode operations. The healing output is relatively similar to the other two heals, but in my last tier list I did not really consider the role of the healer in off DPSing, but that can matter when the DPS check is relatively tight. You need your healers to help with the DPS. And of course it can be the case when you're progressing through a Nightmare Mode ops, and also with the new Illum lair boss it helps. Bodyguard is good at off DPSing, and on top of that it has very strong defensive cooldowns, which makes it just an overall very well-rounded class, and the most played healer for a reason. Now Corruption, I will downgrade this to A tier, because I think it is just one step below Bodyguard. Takes a bit more damage as the cooldowns are not as mitigation focused, so it can be harder to play. And most importantly, it is not as good at off DPSing. Still a solid class though, so for sure pairing a Bodyguard with a Corruption Sorcerer is a very good combo still. Shield Tech is a very solid tank, has the best passive mitigation, so outside of cooldowns it's very tanky. But on Shield Tech you are also playing the superheated fuel tactical, which as I already mentioned with Pyro has been nerfed. So Shield Tech does a bit less DPS now, it can't immune stuff as well as Darkness. But it's easy to play, so Shield Tech is good if you want to learn the game, because it teaches you to focus on the boss mechanics. Overall though very solid and stays in A tier. Now APPT, I will slightly downgrade this to B tier. Even though it hasn't been nerfed, I think there is a clear performance gap to Pyro. The single target sustain isn't as good. The AoE is worse, AP is also not as tanky as Pyro, and the only real advantage that it has is of course that the burst damage is better for burst phases. But overall, Pyro brings everything to the raid that AP can bring, so most teams would much rather have a Pyro instead of an AP. That being said, AP is still a solid spec, that's why it stays in B tier. Virulence, I will leave it in A tier. It's very solid and arguably the best ranged DPS overall. It's quite tanky, has good DPS, good cooldowns, raid utility with ballistic shield, very, very solid. Similar to Viro, NG will also stay in A tier. The damage is really good, Plasma Probe can cleave off the boss, so when there are adds, NG can actually top the DPS chart on the number of fights without giving up too much boss DPS. Very good spec, and most raid teams would like to have Viro or NG, which is why they are in A tier. Next we have Medicine Operative, which I had in B tier previously, but it does have better off DPS than the Sorg. But then again, the defenses are not that great, especially when compared to Bodyguard. So I will upgrade it because I think the healing output is quite nice and the off DPS can be important. So I will move it into A tier on par with Corruption, but one step below Bodyguard. Next we have Immortal, which for sure is the worst of the tanks. The damage actually is really good, but it also takes more damage compared to Shield Tech or Darkness. And while it's not bad, for sure it's playable, the other two tanks will make your life a little bit easier, and especially also will make your healer's life easier when it comes to Master Mode operations. So I will leave Immortal in B tier. Moving on to Hatred. Now I played quite a lot of Hatred in the last weeks, and I must say the single target is actually insane. It is probably the best boss DPS you can have on many fights, and also the second or third best AoE without needing to swap your tactical. The one downside for Hatred is that it can be quite squishy and you need to be in 4 meter range to really use your tactical. So it can be rough for your healers to keep you alive, which is why I see Hatred one step below the S tier specs, meaning of course I will upgrade it into A tier. On Lethality I wasn't quite sure, but looking at the numbers on Parsley and then also recently playing the spec a bit more myself again, I will upgrade Lethality to A tier as well. It is a very solid spec, good on awkward fights where you have movement phases or boss immune phases, something like Brontes for example. Lethality of course is very tanky, very self-sufficient with the stim boost heal, so you can survive some random boss aggro better than many of the other specs in the game. Damage is good, and of course Lethality also has great AoE and can compete with Hatred for the second or third best AoE in the game. So Lethality, very strong spec for PvE, moves up to A tier. Now for the rest of the specs in B tier, these are kind of like middle of the pack specs that shine in the right circumstances if you are good on them, but in general they will be not quite as good as the specs above. IO for example does good damage and it's quite tanky, but the raid utility is probably one step below something like Virulence or NG, which is why I have it in B tier. Madness is in a similar place to Lethality. It is good on fights with a lot of incoming damage because of the self-heal, but probably also not as good as Virulence. Carnage doesn't do more damage than any, it has worse AoE and worse utility, so while it's certainly playable, it is not one of the best specs for PvE. You can argue whether that belongs in B or C tier, but I'll leave it in B tier for now. So moving on to the specs that I had in C tier previously, looking at the first three, Marksman, Arsenal and Lightning. The reason they are in C tier is simply because the damage is just a bit too low compared to the A and B tier specs. So Marksman of course has the same utility as Virulence or NG, but simply doesn't do as much DPS. And if DPS really matters because you need to kill the boss before he kills you, why would you want to bring Marksman? Similar thing is true for Arsenal, which is just a bit worse than IO, and Lightning, which is just a bit worse than Madness. So while you can play these specs, you might have an easier time picking some of the S or A tier specs. One class where I changed my mind would be Rage, so I will actually upgrade this to B tier. Rage has very good sustained single target DPS, the AoE is also okay. I see it in a similar spot than APPT, because it's not that Rage is really bad, it's just that Vengeance does what Rage does, almost as well, plus it has the best AoE in the game. So in a similar way to how you would rather have a Pyro instead of an AP, you would rather have a Vengeance in most fights compared to a Rage. There are exceptions of course, but this is a general tier list, we're not talking about specific bosses here. So for most fights, I would say Rage is playable, but not one of the best specs in the game. Finally, we have the D tier specs, Fury, Deception and Concealment. And similar to the C tier specs, the damage on these is not that great, but then these are also direct damage melee specs. So when there is movement, they will almost do 0 damage. And on top of that, as we all know, Deception of course has no meaningful way of doing AoE, and the other two are not much better. The one change I will do though is, since Concealment got buff fixed with the change to the Roll Knife talent, which should now be working properly, Concealment actually is one of the highest parsing single target specs in the game, at least on the operations dummy. But then again, parsing is not raiding, and also it's still quite early in the patch. So for now I will move Concealment to the top of D tier, but not higher. That's all I have for today, guys. Let me know what you think about this list in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.